Lillian Gish's house in New York was once a place of elegance and quiet beauty, filled with the echoes of a celebrated career and a lifetime of cherished memories. But over the years, those who stayed in the house began to notice strange and unsettling phenomena, small at first, like the faintest trace of a shadow moving in the corner of the eye, or the distant sound of footsteps when no one was there. It was a house that never quite felt empty, even after Gish's passing. It began innocuously enough. The lights would flicker, sometimes dimming as though responding to an unseen presence. At first, guests attributed it to faulty wiring, but the pattern was strange. Each flicker seemed purposeful, as if someone was testing the room's energy. And then came the paintings. On more than one occasion, one would fall from the wall, landing softly on the floor with a hollow thud. No one could explain how they became dislodged, as the hooks on the nails were always securely fastened. The most unnerving phenomenon, however, was the mirrors. They were large and ornate, hanging in the hallways and on the walls of the bedrooms. One evening, a guest in the guest room noticed the glass slowly becoming clouded, as if it was being steamed up from the inside. She approached cautiously, expecting to find condensation from the humidity. But no, the fog on the glass seemed intentional, as though someone had exhaled a slow, deliberate breath against it, only to vanish moments later. And though the house was often cool, the air in the room felt thick, warm, and heavy, as if it contained the weight of memories, too many memories. Neighbors spoke of hearing faint music drifting from the house late at night, as if Gish herself were still playing the piano she had loved so much. Yet, when they peeked through the windows, there was never anyone inside. Some said it was the house that was haunted, while others whispered that it was Lillian Gish herself, forever lingering in the space she had once loved so dearly. Regardless of the cause, no one could deny the eerie atmosphere that seemed to hang over the house, as though the presence of the legendary actress was still very much alive, in a way that no one could fully explain. The strange occurrences in Lillian Gish's house continued to grow more unsettling as the days passed. It was as if the house, once a symbol of grace and serenity, had become a vessel for something far more mysterious. Guests who had stayed in the house before spoke of the peculiar chill that would suddenly creep into rooms, though the weather was warm and the house was heated. It wasn't the type of cold that you could shiver off. It was an oppressive, lingering cold, as if something was watching from the shadows, just out of reach. But it wasn't just the temperature that disturbed those who entered. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent and everyone assumed they were alone, soft footsteps could be heard, slow and deliberate, pacing the hallways. The sound was faint at first, like someone walking across a thick carpet, but as the hours wore on, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a trick of the house settling. These were human footsteps. Footsteps that seemed to move closer and closer to the rooms where guests slept. One evening, a curious visitor decided to investigate the strange sounds for himself. He had been staying in the master bedroom, the very room where Lillian Gish had spent her final days. At first, the footsteps were no more than a faint murmur, but as the night deepened, they grew impossible to ignore. He rose from the bed and crept quietly to the door, holding his breath, trying not to disturb the air. The sounds were clearer now, unmistakable: the soft tap of shoes against wood, the slow shuffle of someone pacing back and forth, as if caught in an endless loop. When he opened the door, the hallway lay still, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. There was no one there, yet the sounds continued, emanating from the very walls, from the house itself. It was as though the house had absorbed the essence of its former occupant, keeping her restless presence alive long after she had gone. In the morning, the visitor found the mirrors fogged up once again, this time more densely than ever before. The condensation seemed to have a shape, a faint outline of a figure, as though someone had pressed their face against the glass and exhaled slowly. But there was no sign of anyone. Over the following weeks, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Guests who stayed in the rooms near the staircase reported hearing whispers in the dark, hushed voices that seemed to call out to them. But when they tried to trace the source, they were met with nothing but silence. Sometimes, those whispers sounded like words in a language they couldn't quite place: soft, melodic, like a lullaby from another time. The lights, too, grew more erratic, flickering in rapid succession, as if they were attempting to communicate in a strange, coded language. The paintings continued to fall, one after another, sometimes crashing to the floor with a force that left the frames splintered. No one could explain why the house seemed to have a particular affinity for the artwork, but those who had been in the house for long periods began to notice something even stranger. The paintings seemed to shift subtly. Faces in the portraits would change. Eyes that once seemed soft and calm would harden, their expressions darkening with an emotion that couldn't be placed. One evening, an old acquaintance of Lillian Gish's, a former actor, arrived to pay his respects. He had heard rumors about the house but dismissed them as exaggerations. He sat in the parlor, admiring the antique furniture and the faded photographs of Lillian's illustrious career, when the door to the study locked for years creaked open by itself. He rose, cautiously approaching, but as he neared, he felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as though someone or something was urging him to stay away. But curiosity tugged at him, and he stepped inside. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the house. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if every breath required effort. As he gazed around, something caught his eye there. On the desk was a small, weathered notebook, one that he recognized from the days when he had worked with Lillian. He reached for it, but as his fingers brushed the cover, a sudden noise erupted behind him, loud, sharp, as if something had been knocked over. Spinning around, he saw the silhouette of a figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't Lillian, but it was unmistakably a woman. Her shape was hazy, barely discernible, yet he could make out the faint outline of her dress, long, dark, and flowing. She stood perfectly still, watching him, her face obscured by shadows. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The air grew heavier. The very space around him felt alive, pressing in on him. Before he could react, the figure vanished. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sending a jolt through his body. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But as he looked around the room, he saw something else, something far more disturbing. The notebook was gone, and in its place, a new item lay on the desk. A photograph of Lillian Gish, taken long before her death, her face serene. Yet her eyes seemed to be staring directly at him, as though she knew exactly who he was. There was no explanation for it, no rational way to explain the sequence of events. The house, it seemed, had a life of its own, a pulse, a heartbeat that echoed with the past, and with something much darker that lingered in the shadows. The more one stayed, the more it seemed to draw them in, pulling them closer to the mystery of Lillian Gish's life and the haunting presence that refused to leave her home. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The days that followed the mysterious incident in the study were marked by an unsettling tension that gripped the house, tightening with each passing hour. The acquaintance, shaken to his core by what he had witnessed, left the house soon after, unable to explain what had occurred. He spoke little of his experience, but those who knew him could see the change in him, his eyes haunted, his words lost in thought, as if some part of him had been irrevocably marked by the house. But those who remained in the house found that the strange events were far from over. It wasn't just the flickering lights or the fallen paintings anymore. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, a heavy, almost oppressive presence that seemed to watch from the corners of every room. It was as though the house itself had begun to change, adapting to the unseen forces that now inhabited it. The walls seemed to groan at night, settling not with the familiar creaks of an old building, but with a low, almost mournful sound, like a sigh that echoed through the hallways. One evening, a guest staying in the guest room on the second floor noticed something unusual. The moonlight poured through the window, casting long, slender shadows across the floor, when she spotted a figure standing by the foot of her bed. At first, she thought it was just the reflection of a tree outside, its branches swaying in the wind. But then, as her eyes adjusted, she realized the figure was no mere shadow. It was solid, distinct. A woman, tall and thin, dressed in a gown of soft, dark fabric that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Frozen in place, The guest held her breath, unsure whether what she was seeing was real or a figment of her imagination. The figure remained still, watching her with an intensity that felt like it pierced through her very soul. After what seemed like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and began to walk toward the door. The guest, now trembling with both fear and fascination, waited until the figure had passed completely from view before she dared to move. But when she reached the door, she found it locked despite the fact that it had been opened just moments before. It was a small thing, a detail that might be easily overlooked, but it set the house on edge. The feeling of being trapped, of not being able to leave or escape, hung in the air like a weight that pressed on the chest. And it wasn't just the locked doors. The house seemed to manipulate time itself. Those who stayed for longer periods began to lose track of days, as if they were caught in a strange loop. One guest, a young woman who had come to visit a friend staying in the house, remarked that she felt like she had entered a different world altogether. Time moved differently here. Sometimes it felt as though hours passed in mere minutes, and other times the days dragged on endlessly, stretching like taffy. There were rumors, too, of strange lights seen flickering in the windows at odd hours, bright flashes, like lightning, that would appear without warning. Those who ventured close to the house during these flashes spoke of hearing a voice, soft at first, a melody that drifted on the air like a lullaby, then growing louder, more insistent. A song of sorts, a haunting, mournful tune that echoed the pain and beauty of a life long past. But it was the discovery of the secret room that truly escalated the mystery. One afternoon, a group of visitors, all intrigued by the rumors surrounding the house, decided to explore its forgotten corners. They had heard whispers of a hidden room, a place where no one had dared venture for decades. Armed with curiosity and a sense of excitement, they scoured the house, their footsteps echoing in the silence. It was in the attic that they found it. Behind a set of old trunks, they discovered a door, small, barely noticeable, concealed by years of dust and cobwebs. The door was different from the others in the house. Its wood was aged, darker than the surrounding walls, as though it had been there far longer than the rest of the house. When they pushed it open, they were met with a musty, stagnant air that seemed to hold its breath. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, and its only furnishings were a single chair, an old wooden chest, and the remains of a worn rug. At the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its frame carved with intricate designs that were half hidden beneath layers of grime. The glass was cracked, the surface marred by age, but it held an eerie beauty, as though it had been waiting for something or someone. One of the visitors, a young man who had always been skeptical of the house's supernatural claims, stepped forward and peered into the mirror. His reflection was distorted, stretched in unnatural ways, as though the glass itself was warping reality. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something else, something not quite human, moving in the reflection behind him. A figure, a woman, pale and translucent, her face obscured by the mist. He spun around, but the room was empty. The others gathered around the mirror, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. They could all feel it now, the presence that lingered just beyond their reach, pressing in on them from every direction. They felt eyes on them, though the room remained empty. No one dared touch the mirror, but as they stood there, a strange sensation washed over them, as though the mirror itself was calling to them, inviting them to look closer, to uncover its secrets. It was then that one of the visitors, a woman with a keen sense of the uncanny, noticed something on the chest. She crouched down, brushing aside the dust, and found a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn and faded. The book was locked, its pages yellowed with age, but the moment she touched it, a chill ran through the room, a sharp, sudden cold that made the air feel brittle. The others, sensing something had changed, stepped back as the woman slowly turned the lock on the book. Clicked open with an almost audible snap. What they found inside, however, was far more chilling than any of them had expected. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, words in Lillian Gish's unmistakable handwriting, written in a tight, flowing script. But it wasn't just a diary. The entries were different. There was something off about them. The words spoke of a hidden truth, of something that had been buried deep within the house, something the actress herself had tried to forget. As the woman began to read aloud, her voice faltered. And then, at the very end of the final page, there was one last line, written in bold, trembling letters. "Do not open the mirror." Before anyone could respond, the room grew darker, the air thick with a presence that seemed to swell, overwhelming them. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The mirror, once dull and cracked, began to shimmer. The whispers, soft, melodic at first, grew louder, closer, as if the house itself was breathing. The house was alive and it was waiting. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint sound of their breathing, heavy and quick. The temperature plummeted, and it was as though the house itself was tightening its grip, pulling them into its secrets. The woman who had found the book, still clutching it in her hands, slowly turned to face the mirror. Her heart raced, and she felt an overwhelming urge to look deeper, to peer into its depths despite the warning scrawled on the last page. The others, too, were drawn toward the mirror, as if it were a magnet, compelling them to come closer. The once cracked surface was now impossibly smooth, gleaming with an unnatural light. As they watched, the reflection within the mirror began to shift, blurring like smoke curling in the air. Then the figure appeared again. It was the woman, the figure they had all seen before in their brief glimpses. But this time she was more distinct, her features more defined. The figure was dressed in a gown that shimmered like silver thread, her long hair flowing as though moved by an unseen wind. She was not just a shadow in the glass, she was solid, standing there, her eyes locked with theirs through the reflection. A deep, unsettling silence settled over the room, as if time itself had come to a standstill. For a moment no one dared speak. But then, in a voice that echoed in their minds, not their ears, the woman spoke. "Why have you come?" The question reverberated through the walls, vibrating in their very bones. It was not the voice of Lillian Gish they heard, but something more ancient, more sorrowful, a voice that carried the weight of years, of pain, of regrets long buried. The young man who had been skeptical earlier, now trembling, stepped forward. "What do you want?" His voice cracked, filled with an unspoken terror. The figure did not respond, but her hand, her translucent, ghostly hand, reached out, pressing against the mirror. And as if obeying her will, the surface of the glass rippled like water disturbed by a stone. The group gasped as the reflection of the room began to change, warping into something darker, something twisted. The walls stretched and distorted, the furniture becoming distorted, and they could see, faintly, shadows moving in the corners of the room, shadows that were not their own. The woman in the mirror's lips parted again, and this time, the words that emerged were not in English, but in an unfamiliar language, an ancient, forgotten tongue. As she spoke, the room began to hum, the very air vibrating with energy. The book that the woman had been holding slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud. The others didn't dare look away from the mirror, though they felt an urge to run, to escape. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The humming ceased. The shadows vanished. The mirror returned to its former, cracked state, and the figure faded back into the glass, leaving nothing but an unsettling stillness behind. They stood frozen in place for what felt like an eternity, unable to speak, unsure if what had just happened was real. The house felt different now. It wasn't just haunted by a restless spirit, it was a place where something far older, far darker, had taken root. The door to the room, which had been locked tight, creaked open on its own. The coldness, the oppressive weight in the air, lifted as the door swung wide. One by one, they left the room, their faces pale, their minds reeling from what they had seen. They didn't speak as they descended the stairs, each of them haunted by the image in the mirror, the woman in the gown, her eyes hollow and knowing. As they stepped outside, the house behind them seemed to exhale, as if releasing them from its grip. The front door slowly closed with a soft click, but the feeling of being watched never left them. They could feel it. Even outside in the crisp night air, the house was still there, waiting, watching. For those who dared to venture into Lillian Gish's house again, There was no denying the presence that remained. The house was alive with the weight of the past, with secrets that had been sealed away for years. The mirror, once a simple relic of another time, had become a doorway, a passageway between the living and the dead, and those who had looked into it were never the same. Some say that on quiet nights, if you stand outside the house and listen carefully, you can hear the faint strains of a song, soft and melancholic, drifting through the air. It is a song from another time, a lullaby that lingers in the wind, carrying the sorrow of a woman who can never leave, never truly rest. And if you're brave enough to step closer, you might just see her standing by the window, watching, waiting for someone else to step into her world. But beware, because once you look into the mirror, you may find that you're not the one looking at the reflection. It may be her, instead, waiting for you. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.